The quiet streets of Willow Creek never hinted at the storm brewing beneath its calm surface. It was a neighborhood known for its trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and a sense of safety that residents clung to. But tonight, an unease lingered in the cool air. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows as three figures emerged from a dim alley. Damon, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, was tall, wiry, and carried an aura of arrogance that fed his inflated ego. Behind him, Ricky, short-tempered and impulsive, trailed like a second shadow. And then there was Mason, the youngest and most uncertain of the trio, whose jittery glances betrayed a gnawing doubt about the plan they were about to execute. "Let's make it quick," Damon muttered, his voice sharp and low. "We grab the bag, split the cash, and we're out. Easy score." Ricky smirked. "You're always talking about easy. I say we send a message too. Show her who's in charge." Mason shifted uneasily. "Are you sure about this? She's just some random chick. We don't even know what's in the bag." Damon rolled his eyes. "It doesn't matter what's in the bag. It's about respect. People need to know not to mess with us." They watched their target from a distance, a tall woman walking confidently under the pale glow of the streetlights. She carried a designer bag slung casually over her shoulder and moved with a calm self-assurance that didn't seem to fit the setting. Her name was Nyla, and she had just returned to town after years away. Nyla didn't look like someone to be trifled with. Her lean frame, poised stride, and piercing gaze could make anyone think twice. But Damon saw only an opportunity. To him, she was just another victim, someone who'd make the gang look tough in a neighborhood that rarely saw trouble. As they trailed her, Nyla turned a corner onto a quieter street. Damon motioned for the others to follow, his adrenaline spiking as the hunt began. What none of them knew was that Nyla wasn't just another woman minding her own business. She had grown up under the watchful eye of a father who had dedicated his life to training some of the toughest soldiers in the world. Her father, Commander James Holloway, wasn't just a Navy SEAL. He was a legend. Nyla had learned more than just self-defense growing up. She had inherited her father's instincts, his sharp mind, and his unshakable courage. Tonight, as the gang closed in, she felt the familiar tingle of danger creeping up her spine. Ricky made the first move, stepping into her path with a smug grin. "Hey there, pretty lady," he said, his voice dripping with mock charm. "You got a minute?" Nyla stopped, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" Damon and Mason flanked her, their intentions clear. "Hand over the bag," Damon ordered, his tone cold and commanding. For a moment, there was silence. Nyla's eyes darted between the three men, assessing their stance, their confidence, and their weaknesses. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she remained composed. "You don't want to do this," she said calmly, her voice steady but firm. Ricky laughed. "Oh, we do. Trust me." But something about Nyla's unwavering gaze unsettled Mason. He hesitated, his gut telling him they were making a mistake. "Maybe we should just leave her alone," he mumbled, but Damon silenced him with a sharp glare. Damon reached for the bag, but Nyla took a deliberate step back. "Last chance to walk away," she warned, her voice low and serious. Damon's patience snapped. "Just take it," he barked, lunging forward. What happened next would change everything. Damon's hand shot forward, but Nyla was faster. With a quick step to the side, she avoided his grasp and sent him stumbling past her. Ricky's smug grin faltered as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. "Back off," Nyla said, her voice firm but not panicked. She held her ground, her body tense but composed, like she was calculating every possible move they might make. Damon spun around, his face a mask of anger and embarrassment. "You think you're tough, huh?" he growled. "You're gonna regret this." He motioned to Ricky, who stepped forward, cracking his knuckles for effect. "She's just one woman," Ricky said, sneering. "What's she gonna do?" But something about Nyla's calm demeanor unnerved Mason. He stood frozen, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, as if he could disappear into the fabric. His instincts screamed at him that this wasn't just another job. This was different. "You don't even know who you're messing with," Nyla said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Damon laughed, a hollow, forced sound meant to mask his growing irritation. "Oh yeah, and who exactly are you?" Nyla didn't answer. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity that made Damon shift uncomfortably. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face, but he quickly buried it beneath a mask of bravado. Ricky lunged, his hand reaching for Nyla's bag. She reacted with a speed and precision that shocked all three men. With a swift motion, she grabbed his wrist and twisted it just enough to send a sharp jolt of pain shooting up his arm. Ricky yelped and staggered back, clutching his hand. "What the hell?" he hissed, his voice laced with both anger and fear. Damon stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're gonna pay for that," he snarled. But before he could make a move, Nyla spoke again, her tone calm but commanding. "Walk away now, and this ends here," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You don't want to push this any further." Damon hesitated, his confidence shaken. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, not in front of his crew. "Let's see how tough you really are," he said, charging toward her. Nyla didn't flinch. She moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years of training, sidestepping his attack and sending him sprawling to the ground with a well-placed shove. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed through the quiet street, and for a moment, the only sound was his labored breathing. Ricky and Mason stared at her, their confidence evaporating. Mason took a small step back, his face pale. "Damon, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Damon barked, pushing himself to his feet. His face was red with anger and humiliation, and his hands trembled as he dusted himself off. But before he could say anything else, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from further down the street. All four of them turned toward the noise, their eyes narrowing as a tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged from the shadows. The man's presence was commanding, his every step deliberate and measured. He was dressed simply in dark jeans and a black jacket, but there was an air of authority about him that was impossible to ignore. As he stepped into the light, the sharp angles of his face and the piercing intensity of his gaze became clear. Nyla's expression softened for the first time, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Dad," she said, her voice low but steady. Commander James Holloway stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. His gaze lingered on Damon, Ricky, and Mason, assessing them with the cool detachment of someone who had faced far greater threats. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Damon opened his mouth to speak, but quickly shut it again, his mind racing. There was something about this man that made every instinct scream at him to leave. Ricky glanced nervously between Damon and Holloway, his usual bravado completely gone. Mason, meanwhile, couldn't hide his relief. He took another step back, his voice shaking as he said, "We were just leaving." Damon shot him a glare, but even he seemed to realize they were out of their depth. Without another word, he turned and stalked off, Ricky close behind him. Mason lingered for a moment, his eyes darting between Nyla and her father before he hurried after the others. Holloway watched them go, his expression unreadable. When they were out of sight, he turned to Nyla, his gaze softening. "Are you okay?" Nyla nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I had it under control," she said, her tone light but affectionate. "I could see that," Holloway replied, his lips twitching in a small smile. "But it never hurts to have backup." For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. But as Nyla glanced back in the direction the gang had gone, a shadow of unease crossed her face. "They're not going to let this go," she said quietly. Holloway's expression grew serious. "No, they're not. And if they come back, they'll be more dangerous." Nyla nodded, her jaw tightening. She had a feeling this was just the beginning. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was glad her father was here. Because if the gang did come back, they wouldn't just be dealing with her. They'd be dealing with a Navy SEAL who had spent his life training to handle situations far more dangerous than this. And they wouldn't stand a chance. The night was far from over. Nyla and her father walked side by side down the dim-lit street, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Nyla's sharp instincts told her that Damon and his crew weren't the type to let this slide. People like that operated on fear and reputation, and she had just shattered both. "Dad, I know they'll come back," Nyla said finally, her voice steady but laced with resolve. "And when they do, I need to handle it myself." Commander Holloway glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You got the skills, Nyla. I've made sure of that. But these aren't soldiers following orders. They're reckless, unpredictable. That makes them dangerous." "I can handle unpredictable," Nyla replied firmly. "You trained me to expect the unexpected." Holloway sighed, his jaw tightening. He knew she was capable, but his instincts as both a father and a seasoned Navy SEAL wouldn't let him ignore the risk. "Just promise me you'll let me know if things escalate. I'm not about to stand by if something happens to you." Nyla nodded, appreciating his concern but determined to prove she could stand her ground. As they reached her apartment building, she paused, turning to face him. "Thanks for showing up tonight, but I've got it from here. Holloway hesitated, studying her for a moment before nodding. I'll hold you to that. Be smart, Nyla, and stay alert. She watched him disappear into the night, his silhouette blending into the shadows like he was born to them. Once inside her apartment, Nyla leaned against the door, her mind racing. She replayed the encounter in her head, dissecting every detail, every move. Damon had underestimated her tonight, but next time he'd come prepared. Meanwhile, across town, Damon's rage simmered as he paced the small, cluttered apartment he shared with Ricky and Mason. His pride had taken a brutal hit, and his mind was set on revenge. She humiliated us, Damon snarled, slamming his fist onto the kitchen counter. We can't let her get away with that. Ricky, nursing his still aching wrist, nodded vehemently. You're right, we gotta show her who's boss. Mason sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He had been silent since they'd left the scene, and the tension in his body was palpable. What's your problem? Damon snapped, glaring at him. Mason hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know, man. Something about her. She's not like the others we've messed with. And that guy, the one who showed up, he wasn't just some random dad. You could tell. Damon scoffed. What are you saying? You scared of her? I'm saying we need to think this through, Mason said, his voice firmer now. Rushing in could get us all in trouble, or worse. Ricky laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. Trouble? She's just one woman. We'll hit her hard and she won't see it coming. But Mason's unease only grew. He couldn't shake the image of Nyla's calm, calculating gaze or the commanding presence of her father. Deep down, he knew this wasn't a fight they could win. Damon, however, was too consumed by his bruised ego to consider the risks. He began laying out a plan, his voice growing more animated as he described how they'd corner Nyla again, this time with no room for her to outmaneuver them. Unbeknownst to them, Nyla was already preparing. In her apartment, she carefully unpacked a small black case hidden in the back of her closet. Inside were tools her father had given her, a set of communication devices, a compact first aid kit, and a tactical flashlight. She wasn't about to underestimate Damon or his crew, and she knew they wouldn't back down after tonight. She spent hours reviewing her options, mapping out potential escape routes and strategies. Her father's training had taught her to always stay one step ahead, and she intended to do just that. The following day, Damon put his plan into motion. He recruited 2 more guys from a nearby neighborhood, tough-looking men with a reputation for getting their hands dirty. Mason watched uneasily as Damon handed out instructions, his gut churning with a mix of fear and guilt. As the sun set, Nyla made her way to a nearby cafe, hoping to catch a moment of normalcy amid the chaos brewing around her. She sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the street outside, ever watchful. She knew the gang wouldn't strike in broad daylight, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. What she didn't notice was Mason sitting a few tables away, his hood pulled low over his face. He had followed her there, torn between loyalty to his crew and a growing sense that this was spiraling out of control. Mason debated whether to approach her to warn her about Damon's plans, but fear held him back. If Damon found out, there'd be no escaping his wrath. Yet as he watched Nyla, calm and focused despite the storm she was caught in, Mason felt a flicker of something unfamiliar respect. As night fell, Damon and the others gathered in the shadows, waiting for Nyla to leave the cafe. Their plan was simple: ambush her on the way home, overwhelm her with numbers, and take what they wanted. But Nyla wasn't the only one who had been preparing. Holloway, always a step ahead, had been keeping a close eye on the gang. He knew their type: overconfident, reckless, and desperate to prove themselves. And he wasn't about to let them hurt his daughter. Hidden nearby, Holloway watched as the gang positioned themselves, his sharp eyes tracking every move. He stayed in the background, waiting for the right moment to intervene. As Nyla stepped out of the cafe, her senses heightened. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, the telltale signs of an ambush. Her pulse quickened, but she remained outwardly calm, her training kicking in. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel amplified. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Nyla saw movement. Damon stepping into her path with that same arrogant smirk he'd worn the night before. "Miss me," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Nyla's expression didn't change. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes flicking to the shadows where she could see the others waiting. "I warned you," she said, her voice steady. "You should have listened." Damon laughed, but it was hollow, forced. "I told you we don't back down. Let's see how tough you are now." As the gang began to close in, Nyla took a slow, deliberate step back, her mind racing. She wasn't alone this time, and she knew her father was nearby, watching, waiting. But she also knew this was her fight to lead. The night seemed to hold its breath as Nyla stood her ground, her sharp eyes assessing every move. Damon's smirk was the only sound in the still air, his confidence filling the silence like a taunt. Behind him, Ricky and the two new recruits shifted into place, their movements calculated, though less certain than Damon's bold front. Mason hung back, his unease growing with every second. "You really think you can scare me?" Damon sneered, taking another step closer. His voice was louder now, as if he needed the volume to drown out his own doubts. Nyla didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any comeback, and unnerved him in ways he couldn't admit. Her calm gaze was like a mirror, reflecting all the cracks in his bravado. Ricky, impatient as always, broke the tension first. "Let's just get this over with," he snapped, edging closer to Nyla. The way he held his body, stiff, arms tense, gave her all the information she needed. He'd lunge, clumsy and overconfident, and she countered before he even realized his mistake. But Nyla didn't move. Not yet. She let them close the distance, her muscles coiled like a spring, her mind running through every possible scenario. This wasn't just a fight. It was a test of her instincts, her training, her will. In the shadows, Holloway remained still, watching. He trusted Nyla, trusted her skills and her judgment, but every fiber of his being wanted to step in, to end this before it began. Still, he knew better. Nyla had to handle this on her terms, and you would only intervene if it became absolutely necessary. Damon's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "You think you're smart, huh? Think you're untouchable?" He gestured to the others, signaling them to surround her. "Let's see how tough you really are when it's 4 against 1. Nyla's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smirk crossing her face. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice even. Damon ignored her, his pride blinding him to the warning in her tone. He was too focused on the power he thought he held, too consumed by the need to prove himself. Ricky lunged first, just as she'd anticipated. His movements were fast but wild, and Nyla sidestepped him with ease, hooking her foot around his ankle and sending him sprawling to the ground. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed in the quiet street, and he let out a frustrated grunt as he scrambled to his feet. The others hesitated, momentarily thrown off by how quickly she'd taken Ricky down. But Damon barked an order, and they moved in unison, closing the circle around her. Nyla's heart raced, but her focus was razor sharp. She knew she couldn't afford a single mistake. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, calm and steady. "Stay one step ahead. Use their weaknesses against them. Don't let them control the fight." Mason stayed back, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to be a part of this. But Damon's glare pinned him in place, daring him to step out of line. As the tension reached its breaking point, Nyla made her move. She feinted to the left, drawing Damon and one of the new recruits off balance, then pivoted to the right, slipping past them with a fluid grace that left them scrambling to recover. Ricky, now back on his feet, charged at her again, his frustration making him reckless. This time, Nyla met him head-on, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. He cried out in pain, and she released him, sending him stumbling into Damon. The chaos that followed was a blur of motion and sound. Nyla moved like water, her every action deliberate and precise. She dodged, blocked, and countered with a speed that left her attackers stunned. They had underestimated her once, but now they were beginning to realize just how outmatched they were. Mason watched in stunned silence, his heart pounding. He wanted to stop this, to pull Damon back and tell him it wasn't worth it. But he knew it was too late for that. Damon's rage boiled over as he swung wildly at Nyla, his movements fueled by anger rather than skill. She ducked under his punch and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. For a moment he lay there, breathing heavily, his pride shattered. "You done?" Nyla asked, her tone calm but edged with steel. Damon glared up at her, his chest heaving. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, but even he could see the writing on the wall. Before anyone could move, the sound of a car engine broke the tension. Headlights swept across the scene, and a dark sedan pulled to a stop at the curb. Nyla's body tensed, her eyes narrowing as the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He moved with a deliberate slowness, his presence commanding immediate attention. Damon froze, his bravado evaporating as recognition dawned on his face. The man wasn't part of his crew, but he wasn't a stranger either. "Damon," the man said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. What exactly do you think you're doing here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Damon struggled to find his voice, his usual swagger nowhere to be found. Nyla's eyes flicked between Damon and the newcomer, her instincts telling her this was far from over. The man's presence had shifted the dynamic completely, and she had a feeling that whatever happened next would determine how the story ended. The man stepped into the light, his face revealing a mixture of authority and quiet menace. He was older, his presence commanding immediate respect and caution. His tailored jacket and calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. Nyla didn't recognize him, but Damon's reaction spoke volumes. For the first time that night, Damon looked genuinely uncertain, even afraid. "Mr. Rains," Damon stammered, his voice a pale shadow of its usual bravado. I didn't expect you here." Mr. Rains raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He took in the scattered gang, Nyla's composed stance, and Damon's disheveled appearance. His expression didn't change, but the silence that followed was thick with unspoken judgment. "Clearly," Rains said, his tone measured, "but you should have. I warned you about making decisions without consulting me." Nyla stayed quiet, watching intently. Whoever this man was, he had enough influence to bring Damon to heel with just a few words. But what caught her attention was the way Rains carried himself, calm, calculating, and entirely in control. "I was handling it," Damon muttered, glancing at Ricky and the others for backup. None of them met his gaze. "Handling it?" Rains echoed, his voice cool. "By making a spectacle of yourself and dragging my name into the mud." He gestured toward Nyla without looking at her. "Do you have any idea who you've crossed tonight?" Damon opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Rains turned his attention to Nyla, his sharp eyes assessing her with a level of scrutiny that made her skin prickle. "You're not just some random woman, are you?" "No," Nyla replied, her voice steady. "And I'm guessing you're not just some concerned citizen." Rains' lips twitched, the faintest hint of amusement breaking through his stoic exterior. "You're sharp, I'll give you that." He turned back to Damon, his expression hardening. "You've made a mess of this, and now it's my mess to clean up." "What do you want me to do?" Damon asked, his voice tight with frustration. "For starters, stand down," Rains said firmly. "You've done enough damage for one night." Damon hesitated, his jaw clenching as he weighed his options. But Rains' authority was absolute, and after a tense moment he stepped back, signaling for the others to do the same. Nyla didn't relax. She could feel the tension still simmering beneath the surface, the sense that this wasn't over, and she was right. Just as Rains turned to leave, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening as he read the message. Without a word, he looked back at Damon, his frustration giving way to something colder. "It seems you've been more careless than I thought," Rains said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous tone. "This isn't just about her, is it?" Damon's confusion was evident, but Nyla's instincts flared. She could tell that whatever Rains had just learned, it had shifted the stakes entirely. "What are you talking about?" Damon asked, his bravado slipping further. Rains didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Nyla, his gaze piercing. "Your father," he said, his words deliberate. "Commander Holloway. Does he know about this?" Nyla's pulse quickened. The mention of her father wasn't a surprise, but the way Rains said his name, with familiarity and an edge of something deeper, set her on edge. "What does my father have to do with this?" she asked, keeping her tone steady. Rains studied her for a moment before responding. "Let's just say this situation is more complicated than either of you realize, and if Holloway is involved." He trailed off, his expression unreadable. Before Nyla could press further, the sound of approaching footsteps drew everyone's attention. From the shadows emerged two men, their movements deliberate and their faces grim. They weren't part of Damon's crew, that much was clear. Their clean-cut appearance and the way they carried themselves suggested something else entirely. "Mr. Rains," one of them said, nodding respectfully. "We have a situation." Rains' jaw tightened. "Of course we do," he muttered under his breath before addressing the man. "What now?" The man hesitated, glancing at Nyla. "It's classified, but it involves her." Nyla's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea who these men were, but the way they looked at her, like she was part of some larger equation, sent a chill down her spine. "I don't have time for this," Rains said sharply. He gestured to Damon and his crew. "Get out of here, all of you, before you make things worse." Damon looked like he wanted to argue, but one glare from Rains silenced him. Grumbling under his breath, he motioned for his crew to follow, though the tension in his posture made it clear this wasn't the end for him. As the gang disappeared into the night, Rains turned back to Nyla. "You've got bigger problems than them," he said, his voice low. "And I suggest you figure out where your loyalties lie before it's too late." Nyla didn't flinch. "I don't take kindly to threats." "Good," Rains replied, a hint of admiration in his tone. "You'll lead that fire for what's coming." Without another word, he turned and walked away, the two men following close behind. Nyla stood there, her mind racing. The confrontation with Damon's crew had been intense, but whatever this was felt infinitely more dangerous. From his vantage point in the shadows, Holloway stepped forward, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said simply. Nyla nodded, knowing he was right. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much larger conflict, one that would test everything she thought she knew.